Hey! Woo! I am still not used to presenting in a large space like this, so feel free to hoot and holler, because I do tend, yes, because I do tend to feed off of the audience. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Hannah. Before we get started, just a couple bits of information. If you want to find me after this talk on the internet, I'm at @TechGirlWonder. I use she, her pronouns. I work for a company called Carbon 5. We are a product development agency that works with all kinds of clients, from small startups to large enterprises, trying to help them take their ideas from ideas into software. We are hiring and hireable, so come find us afterwards if you're interested, and that's the last you'll hear about that. This talk should come in around 30 minutes, so there maybe will be time for questions, so cool. The last thing is just a brief content warning. This talk does contain discussions of some difficult topics, including gender issues, mental illness, drug use, psychosis, and grief and loss. If any of those make you or a little too much for you, I totally respect your right to step out at any point. I will not bear any judgment. Yes. Okay, let's go. Once upon a time, all you needed to tell a story was a language. About 40,000 years ago, humans committed the first story to a drawing, to art. Between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago, the first story was committed to writing. This is a rendering of the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the first known written stories. About 150 years ago, the first story was committed to film. And about 50 years ago, a man named Marshall McLuhan said that at this point, the power of the mediums themselves had surpassed the stories in terms of their importance in shaping our society. He famously said, "The medium is the message." So my name's Hannah, and I want to talk to you about how programmers tell stories in code. Because our medium is quite complicated, we spend a surprising amount of time just learning the medium and trying to get people able to use it. And to be fair, the medium of code has shaped our society drastically. Lots of other talks at this conference will tell you just how much. But I believe that a good story is as important as the medium we tell it in. And I think that if we as programmers spent a fraction of the time we spend learning our media, learning as well how to tell good stories, we could become much better programmers. So the goal of this talk is to help you become a better programmer. And it's kind of aimed at people who have made it into this industry, just made it in, perhaps by kind of like kicking the door down. And you're here now, and you're trying to figure out now what. I've had a few hunches recently, and I'm not totally sure about these, so just fair warning. The first hunch is that aside from my job title, I actually am a decent programmer. It's only taken 20 years, but I don't believe I suffer from imposter syndrome. The second hunch is that I might actually have something useful to impart to you all about how to become better programmers. And the third is that the best way for me to impart what I think I know is to tell you my story in tech, of how I got into tech, or specifically 4 different stories of how I got into tech. If that sounds a little bit odd, just bear with me. And at the end, I'd ask everyone to give me your feedback on whether what was most and least valuable to you in this talk. Okay, part 1. You've probably been asked this question somewhere near the beginning of a technical interview. How did you get into the tech industry? This is how I answer that question if I am in a job interview. I've been programming since I was really young. But after, let me reset. I've been programming since I was really young. I got a degree in computer science, but when I left college, I was really idealistic. And so I worked in nonprofits for 10 years before getting back into tech. So that's the story I would give. I have been programming since I was really young. I actually started in junior high. And part of the reason that I was drawn to programming is that the basic mechanics of programming were something that made a lot of sense to me. I was quickly able to pick up variables and loops, and the sort of imperative logic of basic programming was not, I was good at that. And when I've taught code school, I've seen that people learn that stuff at pretty different speeds, right? Like there's actually a lot of variation in how quickly people pick up the mechanics. And I've been thinking about the keynote yesterday and how this variation in speed of picking up the basics, when you combine it with this sort of like systematic refusal to do traditional instruction, in the kind of like, to help people get these basic mechanics, it creates this kind of artificial barrier, right? We just expect people, you either get it or you don't, and then we take it a step further, and we look at people and we say, that person's a good programmer, or that person's not a good programmer, and that's based just on whether they are able to pick up these mechanics. But for me, when I think about that, I think about if you were asked to find the next great writer, and of the next generation, you walked into a second grade classroom and you just looked around and picked the kids who were learning to read the fastest. And you said, these are going to be, the next Octavia Butler or next, whomever. That would be inaccurate, right? So what I found out was pretty quickly, I found out I was not a great programmer. I spent a year and a half trying to write a 3D game engine to emulate what was then the crowning achievement in computer graphics, a game called Doom. And I kind of failed. I wrote something, it ran, it looked sort of similar, but it just crashed about every minute. And at that time when it crashed, that meant the computer crashed and you had to reboot it. So when I was developing it and starting to work on this really large project, I found that I was starting to get lost. I couldn't even remember what half the files even did. The worst part is I thought I'd done everything right? I did all the things you were supposed to do. I unrolled my inner loops into assembler so they could be faster. I used the hottest, greatest architectural techniques at the time, something called object-oriented programming, and the super new hotness called class inheritance. And it didn't work. It still didn't work. A couple of years later, when I was in college, the Doom source code was released, and I read it, and it was kind of boring. It wasn't that neat. It didn't seem to have any particularly great architectural patterns. It was written in C, not the super hot new C++. And the way that it was broken up were kind of basic. It wasn't super well commented, which I had learned was the way to write a sign of good code. So I only noticed one thing about it, and that was that I could keep reading. I could kind of just read a file and follow along. And it was all kind of consistent. It made sense. But I sort of threw my hands up looking at the Doom source code, and it took me about 15 years to realize that I had missed something. This brings me to a slightly more honest answer about how I got into the tech industry. I'd like to tell it to you now. After I graduated college, at the age of 23, I decided to transition genders. Back then, transition was kind of a thing that totally upended your life. I lost my job. I was not an established programmer, so I ended up with minimal income, and then I found a career in nonprofits. And for a long time, I actually didn't think about tech. It sounds really sexist to say this now, but I believed at the time that part of my transition was that I simply could not be in a profession that was that masculine. It was only years later when I read about other women in tech that I got the courage to dive back in. Now, this is not a secret story. You have not been let in on a great secret. Most people who've known me for some amount of time know that I'm trans. But I don't tell that story to people in a job interview. And it's not because the other story is untrue. It's just that I know my audience. Who is the audience of a computer program? Obviously, we're talking to a computer, right? That's one audience. I was taught at a very young age that a computer program is a sequence of instructions to tell a computer what to do something, right? But the computer could take those instructions directly in the language of ones and zeros. It does not care about object-oriented programming. It doesn't care about functional programming. It doesn't care about declarative UI components with unidirectional data flow or whatever the latest, greatest of hot techniques are. I would throw out there that if computers, if they ever become able to program themselves, the programs that they will write for themselves will be in a format that almost none of us understand, right? So the audience of a computer program are the humans who have to build it and who have to interact with it and who have to maintain it. This isn't really a new idea, but I feel like we constantly lose sight of how central this is to what we do. Almost everything we do in programming, down to even the concept of variables, is to help ourselves understand, not the computer. Why would I adopt the current trends, functional programming, immutable data structures, algebraic data types, even maybe I get into some crazy lambda calculus hotness. I like all those things, but the reason I adopt them is most likely because I tried writing an imperative program, and I found that my human brain kind of sucked at it. Right? Can you tell what's going on here? If you can, much respect to you. You might know that it's the Go language because half the lines are if error equals nil, or not equals nil. Sorry, I've been waiting to get that Go troll in. Or the worst part is, sadly, this is code that I shipped like a month ago, right? This is what I'm writing today because I'm writing in Go, and it's this really complicated program. And while this looks like a mess, it actually is the result of several iterations of making sure it's exactly right. And there are more comments in the actual source code. But you write this really awesome imperative thing, you worked on it forever, and you show it to someone else, and they're like, what the heck is this? I do not understand it. So if we accept that the audience of programming is humans, right, then all we're doing, to some extent, is trying to communicate with each other through the medium of code. We are telling stories. And so I think it's kind of funny that we think these patterns are going to solve all our problems, right? If you imagine you walk into a writer's workshop, and there's a vigorous argument going on. And one side of the room is like, the key to writing is to use similes. And the other side is like, no, the key to writing is to use metaphors. And they're fighting it out. It's like, it would be ridiculous, right? I tried patterns. They helped, but they didn't help a lot. Another tool we have, which I actually think is weirdly potentially more useful in certain cases, is our frameworks, right? Our frameworks what they can do is they can reduce the scope of the complexity of the narrative we're trying to tell by providing kind of this preset structure. And the way I think of this is if you think about a review of an action movie or a romantic comedy, right? They'll say, wow, this story's really formulaic. And I think the frameworks are sort of the same thing. They provide you a good formula for doing a certain set of things. But then the problem, just like with an action movie or a romantic comedy, is that when you try to do something new, they kind of leave you out on your own. So if our patterns are just patterns, and our frameworks are great, but they don't help you do something novel, how do you actually get good at programming? So at this point, I would like to tell you the real story of how I got into the tech industry. It goes like this. The realization that I wanted to transition came from taking LSD. And before, before you think that I am a huge cheerleader for psychedelics, though I am, that experience was necessary, but extremely unpleasant. And it actually led to me, it was the beginning of a slow and very intense mental unraveling that ended with what is professionally called an extreme psychotic break. And that kind of debilitated me for a few years. For 3 years, I was out of work. For 5 years, I was on government disability. For that time, I carried the diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder. And when I returned to work, it was working part-time in a clothing store before later getting into nonprofits and much later into tech. I don't tell that story to a lot of people normally. I guess now I have. But it's true. And yet, the other stories that I've told you are also true. Each story, they just leave things out. And so each story actually captures a different truth for the person receiving it. And I try to tell the right story to the right person receiving it. All of these stories actually encompass, for the interview, I tell this story that is this like easily digestible soundbite, but it has a nice little nod about the nonprofits that makes it sound like I'm a well-rounded person. For people who've known me a bit, the story of my transition kind of humanizes me, and it offers a bit of understanding to who I am. It has this nice little ending of like gender-affirming ending of like triumph over adversity and the power of female role models and all that. And this other story is also a story of triumph over adversity. It's just a little bit more messy. It involves some topics that aren't as fun to talk about because people tend to make judgments about it. But it actually has more value to me, and it has more value because I know that the adversity involved was actually so much greater. The trick here is finding the right meaning for the situation. All three of these stories cover about 15 years of my life. So when I'm answering it, I kind of have like a data compression problem, right? Like there's way too much information to answer in 3 sentences, all this different stuff. So I have to leave things out. And so then the question is, like, what do we leave out? How do we decide what to leave out of a narrative to give it meaning? So I accidentally took a graduate level course in how to do this when, during my nonprofit career, I ended up one of the founders of a small nonprofit for transgender people of color in Los Angeles, and I became accidentally our unpaid grant writer. Like most underfunded nonprofit groups that work with multiply marginalized populations, our work was pretty messy. We did a lot of different things. We helped a lot of people. We sometimes didn't help people when we should have. It was, a lot of complexities. We had this approach, which was we were going to solve problems for people with multiple oppressions that were hundreds of years in the making with local issue organizing campaigns in Los Angeles, which is a tall order. If ever there was one. We did this, we fought through internal battle and strife and whatnot. And then, in order to get funding, I had to take all of that and I had to compress it down into this like 8-page narrative that was going to be given to a foundation to evaluate whether to give us money. And that foundation was probably a foundation that worked with gay and lesbian communities. Honestly, it probably worked mostly with white gay and lesbian communities. They had probably never funded transgender people, and they certainly had not funded a group made up mostly of transgender people of color. What I learned to do in grant writing was to seek the heart of the truth in the moment. And what that means is what I would do is I would try to find like 1 or 2 key accomplishments that could go down to like just a sentence or two that were really clear. And then I would look at kind of like the overall picture of things, and I would start to remove some things that made things inconsistent. Not like changing facts, but just taking things out that created inconsistency in the narrative. And what I would also do is break apart different aspects of our work into different sections where each section told a little mini story that made sense in and of itself. In fact, what I was doing was I was constructing like this system of meaning through which someone who didn't know much about the populations that we served could look at this and understand our work. And it had an internal consistency, and it captured what was important. So this sounds obviously a little bit different than a software system, but maybe it's not. If you are writing for a startup, how likely are you to build the system, a system that looks exactly like it will in its final version? How likely are you to cover all of your users' needs? Better question, how many startups even know who their users are? And even more, even if they do know who the users are, how likely are the users who like the product when it starts going to be the same users who like the product if it's widely successful? I think of most problems that I'm working on in software as being a little bit like this. Every software system has to solve a real-world problem. Otherwise, I mean, there's not a lot of point in doing it unless you are a pure mathematician. And real-world problems are big and confusing, right? And they don't have closed ends to them. And so every one of the solutions you write in software is partial, right? You just solve one little thing that's the core, and you think there's a bunch of other things there's a bunch of other things you're not solving. But the really interesting thing is there's a whole bunch of things you don't even know you're not solving, right? The actual problem space is probably bigger than you know. So the way I learned to write grants, to do this process, was through practice, feedback, and revision. That's what they do in writers' workshops. They read each other's stories, and they give individual feedback. So it was just a process of kind of getting better slowly with lots of feedback. And this is probably the most disappointing part of the talk, when you're waiting for the 3 steps to becoming a better programmer, and the problem is there are no steps, right? There's just this individual feedback and revision loop. We almost never get our code right on the first try. Even if it runs, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense to someone reading it. And we probably have to go back and change it. And so the practices that I have leaned on over the long term are the ones that build the feedback loop into the process of programming itself. The things that I tend to gravitate towards over time are testing and pair programming, kind of the standard Agile stuff. But what I love about them is they assume revision and refactor is a core part of the process of writing code. It's not something you do 3 months later when you have tech debt. And I think it's also interesting that we have these somebody will give you advice like, if you're stuck, take a break and go for a walk, right? What happens there? Well, in some way, what we're saying the reason that works is we're acknowledging that there's a certain creative component to the coding process, and there is a little bit of an inspiration that just strikes when you step away from the computer. So, we come towards the conclusion, and I hope that I am not leaving you're probably feeling a little disappointed, because it seems like our moral is to be a good programmer, keep practicing. That's not an answer I'm super excited about, so I'd like to leave you with one more story, and maybe one more tool to maybe make it a little bit better. So I've been thinking about my story, getting into programming, and I've been reminding myself of some parts that I leave out, even to myself a lot of the time. So here are those parts. So I was born to wealthy parents. I had access to computers at a very young age, and I had a lot of resources. And this fed into my year, when I had all of these challenges with mental illness. My mom actually took a whole year off of work just to take care of me, and that was something she could do. And honestly, while I was on government disability, my parents also sometimes supplemented my income. So I had all of this support. They even eventually accepted my gender. And as I was moving through those worlds, when I was still struggling with this, when I was moving through the mental health world and the trans world, I would encounter people who were struggling with almost the same things I was, but they didn't have the resources, right? And their outcomes were not good. Honestly, I have two of my best friends from my 20s passed away in their early 30s. So my story is one of struggle and triumph, But it's also one of privilege, and also something called survivor's guilt, the feeling of why was I allowed to make it? I leave out the whole truth, but if I leave out this part of the truth and I get attached to this idea of just every new situation is adversity and struggle and, overcoming it, it forces me to confront life in a specific way. And not every situation in life is like that. All of us tell stories to ourselves, both to ourselves and to other people. If you've never had to think about your story or tell it to someone in a way that left a couple parts out, I don't want to assume too much, but you may be coming from a pretty intense position of privilege. I have this harebrained belief that marginalized folks are often some of the best programmers. And the reason is, I think that is that marginalized people have this experience of constantly changing and revising our own stories and battle testing them till we can sort of force people to listen to them in a world that doesn't necessarily want to hear our stories. But my therapist says, I do have a therapist, that our stories are just stories. They're only valuable in terms of the truth they tell about the present moment. And so she says it's best to hold them lightly, to be willing to let go of your stories and rewrite them whenever it feels appropriate. And if I had a parting piece of advice about how to become a good programmer, it would be to take the process lightly. Be willing to constantly try new ideas, techniques, and when they're not working for you, let them go. Right? If you're into functional programming, but at some point it doesn't feel right, let it go. Try something new. Learning is made much easier, I think, when you let go of your sense of perfectionism. The truth is that after 20 years of programming, when I go to work, I just try to do the best job that I can for that day. I try to make today's narrative make sense. I try to write as awesome a story in whatever context I'm in for 8 hours. And then I throw it out and start again the next day. Thank you. Oh no, we have time for questions. Shoot. I mean, yeah, if anyone has questions, yeah. Yeah, go for it. The illustrations, yes. Oh my God. Yeah, so I made those illustrations. I'm really excited about it. Yeah. Okay, so there's this crazy thing called the iPad, and it's pretty wild because, God, I sound like a total Apple advertisement here, but I mean, I've okay at art, but I'm not I never consider myself an artist. That iPad, man, it with you put a pencil on that and you can do things you would not have thought. I mean, a lot of it is done with taking an image and then tracing and drawing over it. That helps because the thing I'm kind of the least good with is getting the lines right. So yeah. Yes. Go ahead. Yes, you in the green. Sorry. Uh-huh.
Experience level that you have you found that your mentoring has improved as you've added your stories and code better and looking at what you learned from reading the source code for Doom? It was really readable.
Mm-hmm.
That when you're mentoring people, do you feel like that's helping them out because that you made your code more readable by learning this yourself?
I'd like to think so. I'm still. I mean, there's probably another talk about the other side of this, which is how to become a better teacher and a mentor, right? That is similarly, at least in my experience, based on a lot of practice and revision and trying different things. I found that, so I work at a company that does a lot of pair programming. And so I do a lot of mentoring through pair programming. And unfortunately, for the last year, I've been heads down on this Go project where I've done very little mentoring. I think, though, that I'm trying to figure out something that I've been thinking about is could you build an actual like lesson around software architecture? And I think it would be interesting to give people like a problem, a contained problem people who've been programming for 2-3 years, this is not like a how to get into programming exercise. Give folks who've been programming for 2-3 years like a contained software problem that you could solve in, like 3-4 hours, right? And then actually look at a room full of solutions and talk about each other's solutions. So that's something that I would like to try. And certainly when I am working with folks, what I often will say is like, what does that code mean? And can you make that meaning more clear? And some of that comes from like the way my mom taught me to write, which was very intense. Like her method was to look at like a paper and just go, this doesn't make sense, And so I feel like, so I try to do that in a slightly more compassionate way. But I don't feel like I'm an expert on mentoring, just to be clear. I'm still trying to figure that out. Yeah. Yes.
Do you have any advice about how we can get better at telling stories?
Yeah, no. Well, I think that.
Can you repeat the question?
Sorry. How can we get better at telling stories? I don't know. Like, I would say my telling stories started with telling jokes, right? Like, I like to tell people like little opinions and ideas about life that may be drawn from an experience or two. And that's like the simplest thing. I think, honestly, the way we start telling stories is talking to each other. If you like writing, maybe write journal a little bit, try that. Someone was talking about journaling as a good method to like deal with your first or second year of coding, which I think is really interesting because it's that reflecting. I think that the way you get to be a better storyteller is to reflect on your own experience, which a lot of us do, but like sometimes we don't do it that intentionally. And if you develop the habit of like actually recording what happened and what that meant to you in that moment, I think you'll get that'll help maybe get you to be a better storyteller. You come out to Los Angeles, there's a whole city full of people trying to figure that out. I don't really, but I'm not part of them, so. Yeah. Go ahead. Yes.
What does that say, or is there something more to be said about like what story we're in right now, and what story is going forward? Like, how does the story end? Is there something that is there meaning to the story that's not yet described? That's what I'm trying to ask.
Yes, I think so. I guess all of our stories end with death, but like that's sorry. I apologize. I was like, well, where does the story end? Okay, well, it ends when you die, I guess. Sorry. Shoot, I'm just thinking about that. Like, so the question is there, let me see if I understood the question. The question is there more meaning of our stories yet to be revealed, even though they are often about memories in the past? Is that right? Yeah. Yes.
Sometimes you don't want to rewrite them, you just want to
Sure.
change them going forward, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah. So I was talking to somebody yesterday and they were like, well, do you mean just like denying your own memories? And I was like, no, not really, right? Like, here's the thing what I know of memory is that my understanding is that our memories of events that have happened are not actually all that accurate often. Like, as soon as something happens, we remember it in a slightly different way in our minds, particularly because what actually makes it to the frontal cortex is like just a small sliver of what's going on. And I think, so when you look at that, the basic events don't change, right? Like, all the things that have happened, but the meanings that we assign to them. This happened, and that meant something, that meant this, and even more intense, that meant this about me, right? Like, about who I am as a person. Like, all of that is, to some extent, yours to reassign, right? And I think we keep reassigning that. Even as I was writing this talk, I was on a trip for a client, in Europe. And just the past year or two, I got to fly internationally for code, which was, I know it's silly, but it was really exciting, like to get to do something like that. And it was like this weird thing where I was like, well, now it's interesting because I have this whole story in my talk, but now I'm kind of experiencing what it's like to move around the world in a way that I didn't from my 20s, 30s, or anything, And so, yeah, and so who we are continually changes, and you should be able to constantly change that. I don't think it's worth getting too attached into an idea of who you are in a given moment. I mean, like, I was a pretty antisocial, nerdy person at one point. I'm not that person usually anymore, so... sorry, that's not like a statement of overcoming, but it's just sort of like sometimes people will tell me, oh, you're so extroverted, and that makes me awkward, because I'm like, I'm not extroverted. How dare you? Anyway, we have 4 minutes left. Wow, I left like a while. Well, I don't know, yeah. Is there? No? Okay. Well, if there are no more questions. Oh, wait. Sorry, continue. Yes, question. Sure.
My knee-jerk reaction is you can look at your audience as being like either the users of your product or the runtime that the machine interacting with, or your coworkers essentially, right? The other people that are going to read your artifact. And it seems like what you're getting is you're trying to balance all three of these things. Is that a fair characterization?
I mean, in this context, I'm mostly talking. This is about the audience for code itself, not the product. Like, to some extent. I mean, obviously, the product itself shapes the code, and I think one of the biggest mistakes you can make as a programmer is to get focused on the code for the code's sake and not for the problem it's solving. But I also am talking about how we write code that we can work on and other people can work on, and we can maintain and grow over time. My sense is that most of the problems that we have in software that lead to most of the bugs, I mean, they're not really the machine's fault, right? Like, mostly the machine is pretty consistent in doing what you ask it to. The problem is that we're not, like, it just is not a language that we naturally understand. So we are building all these systems to make it easier for ourselves to understand it in such a way that we don't introduce bugs into the software. I mean, even like something like functional programming, like I actually really love it. But the reason that mutating data everywhere is bad is not because it's fundamentally bad for the machine. It's bad because it makes it harder for us to remember, because our memory is not that great for that type of thing, to remember where we changed something that could be causing a problem. So, yeah. Is that helpful? All right. Oh, yes, one more question.
I know you made a jab/joke about error equals nil.
Oh, yeah, error not equals nil. I realized I said that wrong. Yes. Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. Well, error equals, that's Go, which I would say is not really, that's more like imperative-ish programming. My experience with selling functional programming is, this is really terrible, but the short version is the moment you mention, abstract algebra, category theory terms, people tend to tune out. I always introduce it. Gary Bernhardt gave a talk here at Strange Loop 3 years ago, but he has this thing where he doesn't record his talks. And it's like his basic point was he's talking really about immutability. And I think that that's the core of functional programming. Everything else is about building stuff on top of that. And how to deal with the fact that you have to have side effects in the program. But I think that when I think about functional programming, I always think about it's really about copying data rather than mutating it. Because by doing that, you kind of do this built-in ability to you introduce a layer of predictability into your code. And I really like that about functional programming. And to some extent, this talk is a bit of a reaction on my part to my own obsession with it to the point where I'm like, you know what? I'm pretty sure that you cannot reduce software to a mathematically provable problem, right? I mean, that would be nice if we could get there, but I feel like the problem is that software exists in the real world, and the real world has humans involved, and so software as well has to work for humans, and they tend to do things you don't predict. I mean, at the most intense level, you have all the hardware that could fail at any given moment, which is always interesting to me. I go to Erlang conferences, and I'm always like, well, what happens if like the server center experiences a power outage and their UPS doesn't have a backup or something like that? And how do you keep it? How do you get the 9 nines uptime? And they're like, we try to figure that one out in the moment. And I'm like, okay, well, there's still a problem there. Yeah. Anyway, cool. All right, that's all I got. Thanks.